The portrait looks ordinary the first dozen times you glance at it. A man in a dark frock coat stands with a hand on the back of a carved chair. A young woman sits gracefully, her skirt arranged to show just enough of the train to justify the dressmaker's bill. The backdrop is the fashionable sort photographers in 1912 favored: painted columns and a suggestion of ivy, a garden that has never known weather. The bride's waist is cinched, the bodice modest, the lace at the throat expensive without being boastful. Her veil sits like a scoop of sugar on her hair, pinned with care. The groom's expression is the solemn pride of a man who has purchased something valuable and intends to prove worthy of owning it. On the mount beneath their feet, the studio's stamp announces respectability: Ormsby and Sons, photographers, High Street. Someone, probably the bride's sister, has penciled the date on the back in a neat schoolroom hand: June 8th, 1912. The whole thing smells, even now, faintly of lavender drawer paper and coal smoke that no house on their street in those years entirely escaped. The photograph is handsome, at first, and then, after your eye has swept the veil and the boutonniere, the crisp line of his collar, you notice the bride's hands. Only then do you feel the jolt. Her left hand, the one that should sparkle for posterity, rests obediently atop the closed fan in her lap, displaying the new ring. Her right should mirror it, relaxed along the satin slope. It does not. It tightens, subtly, the tendons raised, the knuckles paled with pressure. Between the fingers, a few fine strands betray themselves. Not thread, not fringe. Hair. Human hair, looped and wound into the smallest of braids, no thicker than a matchstick, dark against the whiteness of her glove, as if trying to be seen, and failing and trying again. In the glossy black of her pupils, if you lean very close to the paper and let the window's square of daylight travel into the image, you catch a crescent of something pale held low, just outside the lens's blessed narrative, the curve of a tiny locket, open, its pearl face turned inward. The fan hides most of it, not quite all. The studio lamps have put a fleck of light on its hinge. You can measure the ache of her desire to keep it with her by the way her hand refuses to relax. Once you see the hair, you cannot unsee it. Once you see the locket, you cannot forgive the photograph for pretending it isn't there. It helps to step backward in the day, and then farther back. Her name is Eleanor Hart, and she has learned to live as the sort of girl the town approves of. Cheeks fresh, curtsy shallow, voice gentle. Her father keeps books for 2 mills and a foundry, and complains about none of them at the dinner table because complaint tastes like disloyalty, and disloyalty makes a man's food sit badly. Her mother keeps a parlor that smells of beeswax and flint, as if the furniture itself were prepared to spark into duty when called upon. There was a time when Eleanor laughed without measuring it. She ran to the river with a book, shoes dangling by their laces, and learned the grammar of water, stones, minnows, reeds, the way light breaks. That summer she met Arthur Layton, brown-eyed, not tall enough to be a boast, hands nicked from real work, who addressed the river like a friend and the town like a place to pass through on the way to his life. He was a ship's steward on a White Star liner, and the way he said White Star carried sunlight in it. He told her the names of ships as if they were saints. He told her about the second-class promenade and the orchestra that played better than the one at the assembly rooms, and the way salt dried on lashes after a windy watch. He told her that spring of a new ship that would carry its own headlines like bunting across the sea. He would have a berth. The company had promised. He laughed at the notion of unsinkable with a decent man's respect for the sea and an indecent man's appetite for luck. "Nothing's unsinkable," he said easily, sitting on the riverbank, ankles in the weeds, "except love that hasn't yet been tested." She smiled and threw a pebble, and the pebble made a ring of answer on the water that spread and spread until it touched the bank where her skirt lay. They were 19. It is gentler for a minute, to let the world fall into romance and leave it there. It is not where the world stayed. In February 1912, Eleanor learned her body had noticed the summer they'd made between themselves. The knowledge arrived the way all late news does, in small, undeniable increments. First, the calendar misbehaving. Then the morning illness she could hide if she rose before anyone else, and moved the kettle often enough to excuse the noise. Then the way her skin began to possess her from the inside out. She told no one at first, not even Arthur. He had written on ship stationery that made her bedroom smell of coal and far places, and signed the note as if practicing his name for better days. Your Arthur. He would be in Southampton in April. He would have 2 days ashore. He would bring her a ribbon the colour of deep water. He would have stories. He had a berth on the voyage. She meant to tell him then. She meant to tell him everything. In her pocket, she rehearsed the speech the way girls rehearse songs, lowering and raising it until it fit her throat. There are histories you can recite by dates alone. April 10th, the gangways crowded. April 14th, late, the cold seizing. April 15th, early, the decks tilting toward implausible sky. April 18th, the night New York counted survivors instead of stars. And there are histories you measure by the silence afterward. Eleanor's calendar kept both kinds at once. The letter with White Star's crest told her nothing her body had not already told her. The ship had gone down. Names would be printed as they were known. Her letter might have to do the job of a minister, if no minister could be found. The newspapers sold the world a picture of the band, of chivalry, of women and children first, and failed to print the faces that mattered to her. Just one face, really, and the possibility that lived behind it. She kept the ribbon he'd sent in a box with the birth notices clipped from the local paper, the ones that filled the page to the bottom and leaked into advertisements for soap and bicycles. She hid the box in the hem of her winter cloak, the heavy one. When her mother folded it in May, saying, "We can put this away now, the lilacs are out," Eleanor took the cloak upstairs herself and held it until a thought became an instruction. Sew it shut. Sew him safe. Sew proof into what the house believes is empty. She stitched the ribbon and a pair of lines from his letter into the hem, along with a twist of hair she had cut from her own nape and braided doubly small. It was a ritual with no permission and more power than any permission might have had. The child, hers and Arthur's, breathed in August beneath the midwife's hands, a slippery new argument between one world and the other. He was warm and particular and serious, as if the sea had asked him to be precise. He smiled in his sleep. He clenched his fist around her little finger with an authority she obeyed instantly. He lived for 4 months. He left in December, the way winter takes small things as a fee for continuing. Bronchitis, they said, because a word can be a room for grief to sit down in when it has nowhere else to go. What can a woman hold when the world's arithmetic refuses to balance? She held his hair. She braided a length no longer than a promise and tucked it into the small locket Arthur had bought from a Birmingham pawnbroker years before when hopes were cheaper than money, pearl with a hinge that stuck on damp days. She wore it inside her blouse like breath. People say time heals, as if time learns the medicine it needs. Time is a ledger, it keeps its own books. Time polished sorrow like a stone in Eleanor's pocket. It did not erase it. Her mother, practical as a hymn book, began speaking of Calvin Merriweather, 30, owner of 2 carts and a horse to pull them, a man whose hands counted more than they struck. He would not make a girl happy. He would make a household steady. In 1912, steadiness was the kind of love people admitted aloud. Calvin courted with seriousness. He wrote notes with too few commas and offered her his arm as if her weight were a thing he'd pledged to carry. He closed his eyes when he tasted soup and announced, "Oh, that's good," like someone discovering that hunger might be tamed by something other than hunger's own exhaustion. He touched her only when touched, a kindness she was not yet ready to name. He proposed in March. She stood in the hallway by the umbrella stand, the one that talks when you put anything heavier than rain in it, and said yes, because there was a place inside her that had to be warm for the ribbon she'd sewn into her old cloak. Calvin knew about Arthur, but not about the baby. Eleanor told herself that omission wasn't a lie. She told herself truth can be portioned like medicine. Too much, too fast, and you do harm. She told herself many tender things, and some of them were true. June 8th, Photograph Day, arrived with the fugitive breeze that makes even coal towns feel like they have gardens. Ormsby and Sons had a new backdrop that summer and a habit of praising brides in a way that sounded civic. The lamps in the studio spotted skin with a heavy light. The floorboards were tinily brave. The assistant wore a jacket too tight across the back. The camera insisted, as all cameras then did, on stillness as a virtue. "Turn just so, Mrs. Merriweather," Mr. Ormsby said, patient as a clock. He called young women Mrs. on Portrait Day because he believed in naming futures into being. Hand soft on the fan, the other resting on your skirt. No need to grip. The lace shows best when the fingers almost float. She tried to obey. Obedience was the language women spoke to rooms where men in waistcoats moved furniture the way weather moves. She did not trust her body to do as told. She had removed the locket just before they left the house. There had been a conversation the week before in which words like past and clean floated near one another like ships unwilling to collide. She slipped the chain over her head and felt the shock of lightness as violation. "I will carry you another way," she told the air. She took the braid of hair from the locket and wound it around her right-hand fingers, hidden in the glove. It calmed her the way a worry stone calms. It anchored her without asking to be seen. It was a sin against decorum and an act of praise. She could have been still. She could have loosened her hand. She might have, if the assistant hadn't said right then, in a tone of artless cheer that did not belong in any decent room. Funny to think of April. Half the world's families must be redoing their pictures now, with who's gone and who's left. A sentence meant as sympathy, received as splinter. The tendons lifted. The fingers closed. The hair, Arthur's son's hair, their son's, shifted to the seam where glove meets skin. The lamp on the left made a neat tack of light on the locket's hinge she'd brought, though she'd meant to leave it. A thoughtless, tender disobedience to her own new rules. Mr. Ormsby, seeing none of this, nodded and said, "Hold." 1, 2, dash. The plate breathed them in. The paper you hold now gave them back. They framed the print for the parlor. Calvin stood with a small pride that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with his love of being the sort of man who ought to have a framed picture on a wall. He saw the lash of the veil, not the lash of hair between Eleanor's fingers. He saw the ring. He saw the fan. He saw what the room had taught him to see. He did not know where to look when looking required disobedience. Eleanor dusted the frame on Mondays with the rest. She favored the lower right corner near her hand, as if polishing could erase the risk she'd taken that day, could erase the possibility of being caught being more than one thing at once, loyal and still in love, grateful and not finished grieving, bride and mother and widow to a future that had broken before it had learned to stand. "For heaven's sake," her sister Maud said, when she first noticed the odd knot of glove and shadow. "You look like you're clutching something. Didn't they tell you to relax? You'll make people think you were afraid." "I was," Eleanor said mildly, as one tells the weather it is raining. The picture hung in their house for 40 years. People carried it through 2 addresses, and the fuel shortages, and the war, and the days when eggs had to be begged for with ration cards and coaxing. Time wore gloss thin and made the black bleed to brown and the white to cream. A child could trace the edges of the frame with a fingernail and feel where varnish went to velvet. After Calvin died, gently, as if careful not to strain her with exit, Eleanor did something her life had never trained her for. She took the photograph down without asking a man to reach. She turned it over on the dining table, lifted the backing pins with a knife she'd sharpened for apples for years. She slid the picture free and laid it on the tablecloth as if laying out a small boy's clothes for Sunday. She bent, without the dramatics of cinema, and pressed her lips to the paper where the hair showed in the seam of the glove. Then she placed the print back and sat for a time with her hands in her lap, empty in the ordinary way. The hair itself, what of it? In the locket, it had thinned to a ghost. Hair does not last a century without help. It had broken into strands that refused to be prisoners. Eleanor did not mind. She had kept it long enough. She unstitched the hem of the old winter cloak that afternoon, took out the thin paper with Arthur's words, laid them flat, and smoothed them as if ironing a shirt's cuff. She put the ribbon in her apron pocket. She lit the fire with the scrap that said, "unsinkable," because she had never liked that word. She kept the sentence that argued with it. Nothing's unsinkable, except love that hasn't yet been tested. She pinned that to the back of the picture, hidden where only someone disobedient would find it. Generations have a way of choosing their moment. In 1971, long after the town learned to say television without blushing, Eleanor's granddaughter, Ruth, came to help her grandmother move to a smaller flat with a window that faced a tree. Ruth was 22 and training to become the kind of nurse who stands between machines and bodies and makes peace with both. She lifted the framed portrait from the wall, turned it toward the light, and paused where you are pausing now. "What's this?" she asked, leaning until the light made that same tack on the old locket's hinge. "Gran, your hand. What are you holding?" Eleanor, who had learned all her life to tell the necessary truth only to people who had earned it, put her palm on the table, steady as a paperweight. "Ah," she said, and the syllable held relief and embarrassment, and one last small pride. "A secret I've been holding a very long time." Ruth squinted until the strands resolved into what they were, until the glove's seam became not seam but shelter. "Hair." She looked sideways, afraid she might be wrong and afraid she might be right. "Yes," Eleanor said. "A memory." "Whose?" "My son," she said, and it felt less like confession than like finally letting the photograph exhale. He had Arthur's eyes. He lived 4 months. She told Ruth the shape of him. She told her the weight. She told her about the way he clenched her finger, as if instructing it in a truth it already knew. Hold on. She told her about the sea without saying Titanic, and about the word bronchitis without making it a villain, because sometimes the villain is just air that refuses to be gentle. Ruth put the frame down carefully. "And you kept him in your hand," she said, as if the thought made a new kind of sense in her mouth. "As long as I could," Eleanor replied, "and then I kept the keeping." They unpinned the back together. They found the paper with Arthur's sentence, and Ruth read it aloud, not for Eleanor, who knew it by heart, but for the room, so the walls could have it too. They stitched the backing again, clumsy with love, and hung the picture in the new flat, where the window admitted a different sort of light, and yet found the same tack on the hinge, as if the lamps at Ormsby and Sons had taught it where to land forever. If you encounter the portrait now, not in a family parlor, but in a small exhibit perhaps, at the local history society in a room that smells like resolute paper and the starch of conservators' coats, you will watch strangers make the same journey of sight. They will smile, dutiful visitors to the past, and declare, "What a beautiful bride." Then their gaze will drop to the hands, and the smile will falter. Someone will lean close. Someone will say, softly, "Look." Someone will widen the circle until the detail gathers a small congregation. The label will be kind. Wedding portrait, 1912. Donor, R. A. Merriweather. Note on verso. Mother kept a lock of infant hair in her hand. Her little boy, 1912. No one will write Titanic on the tag. No one will write unsinkable. The story does not need those words. It has a better one, kept. You might be tempted, standing in that room, to judge the secrecy. Why not wear the locket openly? Why hide hair in a glove? Why marry another man and hold a child's life in your hand while promising a future to someone else? Years make easy judges of days they never had to wake in. But if you stay with the picture, and with Eleanor's eyes, which meet the lens and do not flinch, you will see that the concealment is a kind of courage. The world asked her to be only one thing at a time. Her hand refused. The dark secret is not shame. It is love's stubbornness. It is grief's decision to survive without spectacle. It is a bride who would not let the camera erase the part of her the studio would not stage. It sat in the seam of her glove, and it outlived almost everyone in the frame. Calvin. Had you asked him in the long, kind years, when the horse and cart turned into a borrowed motor, and the borrowed motor into a small, proud business with his name on the invoice, would have said he married a good woman. He would not have said he married a haunted woman, because he did not think of it that way. He would have admitted, if Ruth had asked him late one afternoon when he was playing bones with a neighbor in the tiny back garden, that sometimes Eleanor's hand went still in hers while they walked, and his job was to wait for her to come back from wherever she went. He learned to be a man who could wait. Not every man does. When Eleanor died, well past 90, with her fingers in Ruth's palm, the portrait sat on the dresser, dusted that morning by the nurse who had learned, very quickly, whose things deserved reverence. After the funeral, Ruth brought the frame home and hung it above her dining table. Guests admired it. They said what guests say. She would stand from time to time at the sink in the square of her own kitchen light and look over her shoulder and think of how eyes learned to see what they were not trained to see. A hinge's tack of light, the difference between fringe and hair, the effort of stillness, a right hand that won't relax. She would think of all the women in her ward whose hands give away more than their voices can say. She learned, because of a photograph, to look there first. If you now bring your face close to the paper, you will feel the tiniest pull, as if the image wants to climb into the present. You will make out the locket's hinge and the hair's double twist. You will notice the way the glove strains by a thread. And yes, that is a thread, not hair, a stitch giving under the work of carrying. You will notice the way the groom's hand on the chair, you will keep calling him the groom although you know his name, is placed more for the camera than for the woman. You will notice the way the bride's fan, closed, pretty, does nothing to cool the heat of that hidden vow in her palm. And perhaps, if the room is quiet and you permit yourself to be instructed by 100-year-old defiance, you will say, as if to the paper, and to the girl, and to the old woman, and to yourself all at once, I see it. I see you. Keep it. Because that is what the photograph asks. Not pity, not even reverence. Just a promise to look where the world has taught you not to press your eyes to the seam of things, to notice the hair that outlived a ship and a boy and a century, and still insists on being visible to anyone who will disobey the first glance. And if, as you step away, you feel your own hand curl of its own accord, you will understand the final lesson. Some secrets do not hide so much as wait. Eleanor's did. The camera, merciless in some ways, merciful in this, let it through.